October 1st, 1993 in Petaluma, California, began as a typical autumn evening. 12-year-old Polly Klaas was bright, friendly, and well-loved by family and friends. She lived with her mother, Eve Nichols, and stepfather, Rick, also known as Richard G. Vasquez. She had two sisters, Annie and Julia. She was active in her local school and community, soft-spoken, imaginative, and curious. She enjoyed reading, playing with friends, and spending time at sleepovers. Polly had recently moved back from residing with her father in nearby Santa Rosa, a transition that had been difficult but had gradually stabilized. Her mother, Eve, worked to provide her with a more stable home life. Friends described Polly as kind, with a quiet confidence, someone who was gentle but brave. She had dreams, small but earnest, to grow up, to travel, to write stories. On that fateful night, Polly was having a slumber party at her mother's home in Petaluma. Her two friends, both girls her age, had come over. The three girls stayed in Polly's room, talking, watching movies, and laughing. The house was calm and seemed secure. Eve and Rick were elsewhere in the house, asleep or winding down for the evening. That evening would shatter everything. The loss of Polly would ripple far beyond her immediate family. Her name would become known across the country. Her disappearance would trigger one of the most intense and prolonged investigations of its time. Most of all, her death would raise haunting questions of safety, of justice, and of how one loving family would carry their grief forward in search of answers. But that evening, nothing seemed out of place. The slumber party had the air of a normal gathering, a shared night among teenage girls. No one expected that by morning, one of them would vanish. Crime. At about 10:30 p.m., the intruder struck. The suspect, later identified as Richard Allen Davis, forced his way into the home. According to the friend's testimony, the man came into the room carrying a knife he had taken from the kitchen. He told the girls he had come for money and that he meant no harm. But then he tied up Polly's two friends, forced pillowcases over their heads. In the chaos, the friends heard muffled cries, they heard footsteps and a door closing. Then silence. The intruder left, with Polly. The girls remained bound and frightened, unable to act. They later freed themselves and called authorities. But Polly was gone. Because the friends were victims of assault and intimidation, their testimonies were crucial. They described the man's voice, the knife, the manner in which he tied them, and how he controlled the situation. Some detail was fuzzy in the panic, but the outline was clear, a kidnapping from inside the home, with violence threatening. Over the next 2 months, the region mobilized in search of Polly. Law enforcement teams from state, county, and federal levels joined the effort. Media attention soared. Thousands volunteered to search forests, hillsides, rural areas, and abandoned structures. Hundreds of tips came in. Dozens of leads were pursued, many of them dead ends. The family endured months of agony, hoping and fearing. Eventually, Davis would be arrested, convicted, and sentenced to death for Polly's murder, but not before one of the most complex investigations of the 1990s. Discovery. For nearly 2 months, Polly's fate remained unknown. Hundreds of law enforcement officers canvassed terrain across Northern California, Sonoma County, Mendocino County, even beyond. Ground searches, aerial surveys, tip lines, organized volunteer efforts, canine units, and forensic teams all worked in unison. The public was urged to help, and thousands responded. The emotional outpouring was enormous. The turning point came when Richard Davis was arrested on December 4, 1993, about 65 days after Polly's abduction. He was arrested in Escondido, California, on unrelated charges, an outstanding warrant for another crime. Davis had a long criminal record including burglary, assault, extortion, and parole violations. His mugshot and fingerprints were already known to law enforcement agencies. Immediately after his arrest, investigators focused on his possible role in Polly's case. Davis was questioned, and he eventually led detectives to a shallow grave in rural Sonoma County, where they discovered Polly's remains. The location was in Mirabel Park, near Santa Rosa. The discovery brought tragic confirmation. Polly had been murdered. The body was identified through dental records and forensic examination. She had been buried in a shallow, clandestine grave. The time of death was determined to have occurred not long after her abduction, based on forensic data and decomposition. The discovery stunned the nation. What began as a missing child case transformed into a homicide investigation. For the family, confirmation of death was devastating, but it also shifted the mission from rescuing Polly to seeking justice for her. Following the discovery, an intensive forensic effort began. Investigators collected soil samples, trace evidence, and buried items. Autopsy results confirmed cause of death. Toxicology and pathology would shed light on her final moments. The crime scene team painstakingly documented every scrap, every trace, every clue. They knew that in such cases, small details often made the difference between conviction and acquittal. The public and media, initially hopeful for Polly's safe return, now watched with mourning and anger. The pain of loss intensified the call for accountability. The stage was set. Now they would seek to hold Richard Davis legally responsible. Investigation. Once Davis became the main suspect, the investigation intensified in multiple directions. Detectives from Petaluma Police Department, Sonoma County Sheriff's Office, and the FBI formed a joint task force. Their mission, to build a full case against Davis. Investigators cataloged Davis's criminal history and movements. They traced his known locations in the days and weeks preceding and following the abduction. They sought surveillance records, phone logs, witness statements, and forensic matches. They also went back through prior unsolved cases and sightings, looking for pattern evidence. One critical dimension was matching Davis's known behaviors and aliases to timelines. He had moved through California and had used several aliases. Investigators reconstructed his route, potential sightings, and suspicious activity. Interviewing Davis was central. Under interrogation, Davis initially denied involvement. But when confronted with mounting evidence, including witness statements, geographic links, forensic matches, and his own criminal history, he confessed, in part. Davis agreed to lead authorities to Polly's body. Prosecutors and investigators also examined the method of entry, tie knots, ligature marks, and the knife weapon. They compared those with Davis's known criminal MO. The binding of the friends matched patterns found in prior Davis crimes. The knife, traced to a kitchen stock, matched available implements in the household. The soil composition at the burial site matched the terrain where Davis had operated. A detailed forensic and crime scene timeline was built. Investigators established the window during which the abduction likely occurred, late evening, the path Davis took, and where he paused. They examined Davis's vehicle, his shoe prints, his alibis, and the physical evidence on his clothing and vehicle. Additionally, the investigators examined Davis's mental state, record of parole violations, and prior violent behavior. They probed whether he'd planned the crime or acted opportunistically. They also sought to assess motive. Davis was financially desperate. He claimed to have come into the home for money. Some led investigators to believe he perceived the home as lacking a strong security presence. Whether he intended abduction or escalation to homicide remained a subject of cross-examination. The investigation was not without challenges. False leads caused delays. Some tips contradicted others. Some witnesses recanted. Yet the task force remained focused on building a tight case. They undertook cell tower records, handwriting analysis, forensic soil matching, DNA, as available, and geolocation of possible sites. They also anticipated defense strategy, expecting Davis would claim mental instability, attempt to suppress confession, challenge chain of custody, or attack witness credibility. Prosecutors and investigators therefore worked carefully to preserve evidence integrity, ensure proper documentation, and follow legal protocols. Every statement, every sample, every chain of evidence was logged, sealed, and cross-checked. As the pieces fell into place, the case against Davis grew stronger. The confession, the crime scene linkages, The forensic matches and the victim's testimony combined to present a compelling prosecutorial narrative. Davis had abducted Polly, killed her soon thereafter, and buried her in that grave. In the months leading up to trial, investigators prepared exhibits, defense cross-examination responses, and expert witness testimony. They readied forensic pathologists, crime scene reconstructionists, and behavioral experts. The public followed each development closely. The family steeled themselves for a long legal battle. But in the end, investigators felt confident. They had assembled enough to seek the death penalty. Richard Allen Davis's arrest had come in December 1993 in Escondido, after local authorities picked him up on an outstanding warrant unrelated to Polly's case. At that time, Davis was not known publicly to be linked to Polly's disappearance. He was taken into custody for prior criminal charges, including parole violations and existing warrants for assault or burglary. Once in custody, Davis became the focus of multiple jurisdictions, including Sonoma and San Francisco counties. The Joint Task Force acted swiftly to bring him into the fold of the investigation. He was transported under heavy security, interviews were scheduled, and legal holds were arranged. Investigators confronted Davis with mounting evidence, testimonies, and inconsistencies in his story. Davis initially denied involvement or claimed ignorance. But as interrogators presented matching timelines, physical evidence, forensic data, and witness accounts, Davis faced increasing pressure. Eventually, after careful negotiation and legal consultation, he gave a partial confession and agreed to cooperate in leading agents to the burial site. Because Davis had a serious criminal record and was considered dangerous, prosecutors obtained formal indictments charging him with multiple counts: kidnapping, first-degree murder, burglary, and other enhancements, e.g. special circumstances such as kidnapping of a minor. The severity of the charges enabled prosecutors to seek the death penalty under California law. During pretrial motions, Davis's defense filed challenges: motions to suppress confession, claims of improper interrogation, and standards about Miranda rights. The prosecution countered vigorously and many motions were denied. The judge ensured the chain of custody, forensic documentation, and witness protection met legal standards. As the trial date neared, Davis remained in custody on death row level security. The sheriff's departments, court marshals, and correctional agencies coordinated to move him between facilities for hearings, depositions, and the eventual trial. The arrest and post-arrest process were well publicized. Reporters covered every court appearance, bond hearings, and pre-trial motions. For the Klaas family, seeing Davis in custody brought mixed relief and sorrow. Relief that someone was finally held responsible, sorrow that the cost of that justice would be drawn out and painful. When the trial finally opened, the state was ready. The arrest had secured the key suspect. The confession, though contested, provided the prosecutorial link. Everything now hinged on evidence, cross-examination, and the jury's verdict. Trial. The trial of Richard Allen Davis began in 1996 in San Jose, California. The prosecution presented a clear and direct case. Davis had willfully kidnapped Polly, murdered her, and buried her body. The defense countered with arguments of mental instability, claim of coerced confession, and efforts to poke holes in forensic links and witness credibility. From day one, the courtroom carried gravity. The prosecutor laid out the timeline. The friends' testimonies were central. They described the assault, the tie-up, the hour of abduction, the voice, and the fear. Their composition, in spite of trauma, was solemn and prepared. The prosecution allowed them to testify with clarity, focusing on detail rather than dramatics. Forensic experts testified on the autopsy. Polly's body showed signs of homicidal violence, likely in the first hours after her kidnapping. The shallow grave, soil samples, and vegetation were consistent with the location Davis led agents to. Pathologists detailed time of death, decomposition evidence, and tissue pathology. Crime scene analysts reconstructed the movements, entry path, binding methods, possible routes, distances, vehicle travel time, and topography. They showed how Davis, once confronted, led investigators to the site and matched the soil, vegetation, and trace evidence found at the burial. The defense attacked the confession. They alleged Davis had been coerced. The defense argued that his mental state rendered him vulnerable. They challenged whether Miranda warnings had been properly given and whether psychological pressure invalidated his statements. They also sought to discredit elements of forensic testimony, chain of custody, and witness reliability. Defense also attempted to minimize the friend's testimony by suggesting stress, confusion, and misperception. Cross-examination probed inconsistencies, memory lapses, and the trauma context. The defense emphasized that no video or direct eyewitness saw Davis take Polly. There was no surveillance footage of the exact moment. They argued the state's case was circumstantial in parts. But the prosecution anticipated these moves. They called additional expert testimony. Forensic psychologists, handwriting analysts, regarding Davis's own letters or statements, soil and botanical experts, and crime scene reconstructionists. They showed Davis's criminal pattern, prior offenses of domestic burglary and assault, to establish behavioral consistency. They asked the jury to consider motive, financial gain, criminal opportunism, and lack of regard for human life. Throughout the trial, the judge carefully managed objections, evidentiary rulings, and jury instructions. The defense pressed motions including suppression of parts of Davis's statements, but the judge denied them based on procedural correctness. The court allowed the confession as evidence, considering that rights advisals were properly given and that Davis had knowingly waived certain rights. After presentation, prosecution made their closing. Polly was a child, in her home, under threat, and Davis crossed every line of morality and law. They asked the jury to convict on first-degree murder with special circumstances and impose death penalty. Defense's closing called for mercy, raised doubts about mental capacity, and stressed the absence of video footage of the abduction. The jury deliberated. After several days, they returned a verdict, guilty on all major counts, including first-degree murder, kidnapping, and special circumstances. The judge, following law and jury recommendation, sentenced Davis to death. Over appeals and obstacles, Davis remained on death row. His appeals included claims of ineffective counsel, challenges to trial rulings, and further arguments about his mental health. But courts upheld his conviction over the years. Davis remained incarcerated, awaiting execution, while the Klaas family continued to press for closure and recognition. Aftermath: Polly's death devastated her family. Her mother, Eve, and sisters Annie and Julia faced an unbearable grief. The knowledge that their child had died, and that what followed would be legal and emotional battles stretching decades. From the beginning, they had to balance mourning with advocacy, speaking in public, enduring scrutiny, navigating legal processes, and trying to preserve Polly's memory beyond the horror. The case had immediate ripple effects. It became a focal point for debates over kidnapping laws, California's sexual predator statutes, parole enforcement, and child safety. At the time, Davis had a lengthy criminal record and had slipped through systems. The public questioned how such a man could have access to victims and whether law enforcement coordination was adequate. Media coverage was intense and sustained. Documentaries, news specials, and crime shows revisited Polly's case repeatedly. Her story became emblematic of child abduction fears. The case also drew scrutiny to the three strikes law in California. Davis' criminal record triggered talk of harsher sentencing regimes for repeat offenders. Over the years, the Klaas family, especially Annie, Polly's older sister, became vocal advocates for child protection reforms, publicity, and support for missing children's organizations. They sought to ensure Polly would be remembered for more than her death, as a child, with dreams and love. In 2024, nearly 3 decades later, discussions renewed about overturning the death penalty or revisiting sentencing in light of evolving standards. Still, as of the latest public records, Davis remains on death row. Some media reports indicate that Davis has challenged his sentence and behavior in prison, but has not secured execution reprieve. The case also left unresolved questions. Some wonder whether other crimes might be linked to Davis, whether unsolved kidnappings or murders could be connected. Investigators have occasionally revisited cold leads in light of new forensic techniques, but no definitive additional convictions have been publicly confirmed. The memory of Polly also forced reflection on the fragility of childhood safety, the limits of law enforcement's reach, and the profound pain of families who lose a child to violence. Her case became teaching for communities, schools, and the media. No case is too old to revisit, no disappearance too small to matter. Though the legal system declared Davis guilty and sentenced him to death, for many, that verdict is only part of closure. The emotional scars, the missed birthdays, and the life Polly never lived remain. The Klaas family continued to speak on her behalf, emphasizing remembrance, reform, and awareness. Legacy. The legacy of the Polly Klaas case is multifaceted. It touches law, media, advocacy, and collective consciousness about child abduction and homicide. First, legally. The case reinforced the power and necessity of coordinated multi-jurisdictional cooperation between local, state, and federal agencies. The integration of forensic science, soil analysis, crime scene reconstruction, and witness testimony in a layered prosecution became a model. Prosecutors crafted how to present circumstantial evidence combined with confession in a way defensible to appellate review. The case also remains cited as an example of how confessions must be scrutinized and how courts manage claims of coercion or mental instability. Second, policy. Polly's case intensified calls for stricter laws against repeat offenders, reforms in parole supervision, and stronger child protection statutes. It contributed to legislative momentum for tougher penalties for kidnapping and murder of children and stricter requirements for criminal monitoring systems. Third, public awareness. Polly's story became part of the national conversation on child safety. The fear that a child could be taken from her home, even at a slumber party, resonated deeply. Her name became part of media lexicon. The public's attention to missing children rose. Her case demonstrated that even with widespread coverage and volunteer mobilization, resolution might take months, yet persistence matters. Fourth, sustaining memory. The Klaas family's advocacy preserved Polly's name as more than a crime headline. They participated in national campaigns, worked with missing children organizations, and kept the urgency of unsolved cases alive. Polly's case is often referenced in true crime documentaries, news retrospectives, and criminal justice courses. Her story teaches about the cost of violent crime, the fragility of innocence, and how a system must sometimes bend toward victims to find truth. Fifth, unanswered questions. While the legal verdict stands, some questions remain. Could Davis have committed other crimes? Did systemic failures allow him access to vulnerable victims? Could more immediate investigative actions have found Polly alive, if not sooner? The family and investigators have occasionally revisited tips and leads. Advances in DNA and forensic technology raise the possibility that new evidence might yet surface. Lastly, emotionally. For viewers and communities, Polly's story remains haunting. It is a reminder that real people, families, and children are behind every crime headline. It calls forth empathy, vigilance, and respect for victims. Her name is not merely a case file. It is a child who smiled, who laughed, who belonged, and who was lost. The legacy is measured not only in conviction, but in how society responds over time, with reforms, with remembrance, and with care. Conclusion. The case of Polly Klaas is centered in unbearable loss, yet guided by resolute determination for justice. A 12-year-old taken from her safe home at night, a daring abduction that ended in murder. The relentless investigation, the arrest of Richard Davis, the convictions, and the death sentence are all part of the public record. But beyond those facts lie deeper truths, that the system must work for the vulnerable, that crime is not merely a statistic, and that families carry pain that no verdict can erase. While Davis remains on death row, and the courts have upheld his conviction, the full impact endures in the lives touched. Polly's sisters, her mother, investigators, and the wider public. The case highlights critical lessons about child safety, law enforcement coordination, forensic advances, and the moral demand that we never forget the person behind the crime. Even decades later, unanswered questions linger. Whether Davis had other victims, whether legal mechanisms can evolve to catch such threats earlier, and whether emerging forensic tools might reveal new insights. But we do know this. Polly's life mattered before she ever became a case, and her memory continues to matter now. If justice is not only about verdicts but about remembering and restoring dignity, then Polly S.'s story must remain alive. Her name must continue to teach, caution, and inspire vigilance. In that way, though she was taken in the night, her legacy endures in the light.